Wife died of cancer and I found a letter where she told my stepson to pretend to like me for money, so I cut him off financially to test if his recent kindness was real. 4 months ago, I lost my wife of 8 years to lung cancer. She fought the disease for almost 3 years before it finally took her. Throughout this entire process, my relationship with her son from her previous marriage has been complicated, to say the least. This is what I need to talk about today. My stepson, Michael, was 11 when I first met him. His father had passed away in a car accident when Michael was only 6, and by the time I entered the picture, he was still processing that loss. From day one, Michael made it clear he didn't want me around. My wife and I dated for about 1.5 years before getting married, but that time didn't soften his stance toward me. The situation was made more difficult by Michael's paternal grandparents, George and Patricia. They were heavily involved in Michael's life after their son's death. They had provided tremendous support to my wife when she suddenly became a single parent, helping with childcare while she worked to stabilize their finances. My wife had been between jobs when her first husband died, and even with life insurance, their finances had taken a serious hit. Because of this history, my wife felt indebted to George and Patricia. They had been there for her and Michael during their darkest times. Plus, they were Michael's last connection to his father, so cutting them out was never an option, even though they clearly disliked me. They thought my wife had moved on too quickly, despite the fact that she had waited 4 years after her husband's death before dating again. The first time I met George and Patricia was at Michael's school play. I extended my hand to George, but he looked at it and turned away. Patricia gave me a cold nod before focusing her attention entirely on Michael. My wife whispered an apology, but I told her it was fine. I understood their protective instincts toward their grandson, but their behavior continued this way for years. After we got married, I took on all the responsibilities of a father. I drove Michael to school, helped with homework, attended his soccer games, cooked meals, and did everything else a parent does. But Michael rarely showed any appreciation. He'd often remind me that I wasn't his real dad whenever I tried to enforce household rules or discipline. I remember one particular incident when Michael was 13. He had stayed out past his curfew with friends, and when he finally came home, I told him he was grounded for the weekend. He threw his backpack on the floor and said, "You can't ground me. You're not my dad." When my wife backed me up, Michael stormed off to his room and called his grandparents. 20 minutes later, I received an angry call from George telling me I had no right to discipline his grandson. These types of incidents happened regularly over the years. My wife always stood up for me, but her hands were tied in many ways. She couldn't simply cut off George and Patricia, who continued to undermine our relationship by telling Michael that I was trying to replace his father. I understood Michael was going through a difficult time, adjusting to new family dynamics while still grieving his father. I tried to be patient, but as the years passed, his coldness toward me didn't improve. When Michael was 15, he refused to join us on a family vacation, choosing instead to stay with his grandparents. My wife was heartbroken, but she didn't force the issue. That week, while we were away, George and Patricia took Michael to visit his father's grave and then to all of his father's favorite places. When we returned, Michael was even more distant than before. By the time Michael reached high school, things settled into a pattern of mutual tolerance. He stopped being openly hostile but remained distant and formal. He spent more time with friends than at home, which reduced our conflicts. I continued fulfilling parental duties without expecting much in return, accepting that this might be as good as our relationship would get. We developed an unspoken routine. I would cook dinner, and Michael would eat quickly and retreat to his room. On weekends, he would leave early and return late. We rarely had conversations beyond basic necessity. My wife tried repeatedly to bridge the gap between us, organizing family activities or dinners, but these efforts usually ended with Michael finding an excuse to leave early or not participate at all. 3 years ago, my wife was diagnosed with stage 3 lung cancer. The diagnosis turned our lives upside down. For the first year, she continued working while undergoing treatment, but eventually, her condition deteriorated to the point where she had to quit. I became the sole provider, managing all our finances and her medical care. The day we received the diagnosis, Michael actually sat in the same room with me for more than 3 hours as we processed the news. There was no conversation, but for once, we shared a space without tension. That moment of unity was short-lived, however, as Michael soon retreated back to his usual patterns of avoidance. We had some savings, and our health insurance covered most of the treatment costs, but there were still significant out-of-pocket expenses. On top of that, Michael was preparing for college. Despite our financial situation, he insisted on attending an expensive university across the country rather than the state school where he'd received a partial scholarship. When my wife tried to explain our financial constraints, Michael accused her of not caring about his future. The argument left her exhausted and in tears. Her treatment was particularly aggressive that month, and she didn't have the strength for conflict. Seeing her distress was unbearable. My wife was too ill to handle the conflict, so I took Michael aside and made him an offer. I would cover his tuition and living expenses if he promised not to cause any stress for his mother. He could have whatever education he wanted as long as he maintained peace at home. Michael agreed immediately. He took my offer a step further by requesting an off-campus apartment instead of the more affordable dorm accommodation. He claimed the dorms were too noisy for studying, though I later discovered from his social media that he was hosting parties regularly. After some argument, I gave in, mainly because I lacked the energy to fight about it. To his credit, Michael upheld his end of the bargain. He was genuinely kind to his mother during her final years. Whether this was because of our agreement or because he truly cared about her comfort didn't matter to me. Seeing my wife happy in her final days was all that counted. During his visits home, Michael would spend hours sitting with his mother, watching her favorite shows, or just talking. He brought her small gifts from school and took photos to show her his life there. These moments gave my wife tremendous joy. When she was too weak to leave her bed, he would bring his laptop and show her virtual tours of museums she had always wanted to visit. My wife never knew about our arrangement. As far as she was concerned, it was George and Patricia who were covering Michael's education expenses. I never corrected this misunderstanding because I didn't want to cause her any additional stress. She passed away believing that her son and I had naturally improved our relationship. As my wife's condition worsened, I took a leave of absence from work to care for her full time. The medical bills continued to mount, and I had to dip into our retirement savings. Michael's tuition and apartment were additional financial burdens, but I never mentioned this to my wife. She had enough to worry about. Michael flew home when his mother's health took a sharp decline. For the entire week before she passed, he mostly avoided me, which was our usual pattern of interaction. He would sit with his mother while I prepared meals or handled medications, then leave the room when I entered. We maintained this dance of avoidance even as we both watched the person we loved slip away. The day before her funeral, something unexpected happened. Michael approached me in the kitchen where I was making calls to funeral attendees. He stood awkwardly for a moment before saying, "Thank you for taking care of her." Then he broke down and hugged me. I was already struggling to process my grief, and his sudden display of emotion caught me off guard. I hugged him back, and we cried together. In that moment, our years of tension seemed to dissolve in our shared grief. After this incident, Michael's attitude toward me changed dramatically. He helped with funeral arrangements and stayed by my side during the service, something I never expected. The next day, he apologized for his past behavior, acknowledging that he had treated me unfairly. He explained that he had been scared of losing his connection to his father and had misdirected his anger at me. He admitted that recently, his behavior had worsened because he was terrified of becoming an orphan and losing his second parent. He had lashed out at me, demanding financial support while deliberately being cold because it was easier than confronting his fears. I told him I understood and suggested that moving forward, we could try to build a better relationship. I explained that I never wanted to replace his father but hoped we could at least be friendly with each other. From that day, Michael's behavior toward me improved remarkably. He stayed for 3 weeks after the funeral before returning to university, and we actually had some pleasant conversations. He helped around the house without being asked and even cooked dinner twice, something he had never done before. Even after returning to school, he called regularly and flew back every few weekends to visit. During these visits, we would go for drives or watch sports together. He started asking about my work and sharing details about his classes. We weren't exactly close, but compared to our previous relationship, this was a dramatic improvement. I believed we were finally developing the relationship I had always hoped for, until last week when I accidentally discovered something troubling. While Michael was showering during one of his visits home, I went to his room to borrow a phone charger. A folded piece of paper was sticking out of his backpack. I recognized my wife's handwriting immediately, despite the shaky script that characterized her writing in her final months. I know I shouldn't have read it, but I couldn't resist. The letter was wrinkled and worn, as if it had been read many times. In it, my wife had expressed how happy she was that Michael had finally made peace with her illness and had been spending quality time with her. The first paragraph focused on their relationship, but the second paragraph discussed me. My wife had written that Michael should try to repair his relationship with me after she was gone. She mentioned that since she had become too ill to work, we had struggled financially, and while George and Patricia might help him now, they wouldn't be around forever. She suggested that building a connection with me would be in his best interest, as I was kind-hearted and would take care of him. She urged him to not burn bridges with the only parental figure he would have left. What disturbed me wasn't the content of the letter but the fact that the entire second paragraph about me had angry pen marks crossing it out. The paper was torn in places where the pen had pressed too hard, suggesting Michael had reacted with intense anger to that section of the letter. There were even small holes in the paper where the pen had punctured through. When Michael came out of the shower, I confronted him about the letter. He stopped in the doorway of his room, a look of shock spreading across his face when he saw the paper in my hands. For a moment, he didn't speak. "Where did you find that?" he finally asked. "It was sticking out of your backpack." "I recognized your mother's handwriting," I replied. Michael sat on the edge of his bed, running a hand through his damp hair. He explained that when his mother's lawyer had given him the letter shortly after her death, he had been upset by the suggestion that he should make amends with me for financial reasons. The idea that his relationship with me should be motivated by practical considerations rather than genuine affection had angered him. But after reflection, he had decided to follow his mother's advice anyway, which is why he had approached me before the funeral. He claimed that the crossed-out paragraph was a reflection of his initial reaction, not his current feelings. "At first, I was just doing what Mom wanted," he admitted. "But over these past months, I've realized she was right about you. Not because of money, but because you've always been there, even when I made it hard for you." He admitted that initially, his change in behavior was calculated, but claimed that over time, he had developed genuine affection for me. He begged me not to misinterpret the crossed-out paragraph, saying he had marked it during his initial angry reaction but had since changed his perspective. I looked at his face, trying to determine if he was being truthful. After years of coldness followed by a sudden change that coincided with more potential financial need, I found it difficult to trust his words completely. I told Michael that first needed time to process this information and asked him to stay with his grandparents until his flight back to university the next day. He protested, crying and insisting his affection was now genuine, but I maintained that I needed space. He continued to plead his case, following me from room to room until I firmly repeated my request. Reluctantly, he packed his things and left. After 2 days of consideration, I thought of a test to determine whether Michael's newfound warmth was sincere or merely motivated by financial interests. I texted him saying I was willing to forgive the past, but from now on, he would need to arrange his own funding for tuition and living expenses. With just 2 years of university remaining, this wasn't an unreasonable request. Many students work through college or take out loans. What Michael didn't know was that my wife and I had a joint will that wouldn't be disclosed until both of us passed away. Contrary to what my wife had implied in her letter, we had set aside money specifically for Michael's future, along with some family jewelry. I had also included him in my portion of the will, since I have no close family members to leave my assets to. But Michael was unaware of this provision. His response to my text was immediate and persistent. Within minutes, he called, but I let it go to voicemail. He then sent a flurry of texts, each more desperate than the last. Over the next week, he sent hundreds of messages begging me to reconsider. He claimed he truly didn't care about the money but was too overwhelmed by grief to handle the additional stress of financial independence. "Please don't do this," one message read. "I can't handle losing Mom and dealing with this too. I need your support right now," another said. "I know I was terrible to you for years, but I'm trying to make it right. Please don't pull the rug out from under me now." The volume and desperation of his messages made me question my approach. Was I being too harsh? Was this test just a form of punishment for years of rejection? I started wondering if my test was too harsh or manipulative. I was also struggling with my own grief, and this situation was only adding to my burden. For several days, I didn't respond to his messages, unsure of how to proceed. After consulting with a few trusted friends, I decided to stand firm. If Michael genuinely wanted a relationship with me, he would understand why I had doubts after years of coldness followed by a sudden change that coincided with potential financial need. One friend pointed out that even if Michael's change of heart was initially motivated by financial considerations, the fact that he was now panicking might indicate he truly valued our improved relationship, regardless of how it started. I messaged him explaining that while I was sorry about the situation, my decision was final. I offered emotional support but maintained that financially, he would need to become self-sufficient. I made it clear that if he accepted these terms, we could continue building our relationship. If not, that would tell me everything I needed to know. 7 days passed without a response. Michael was scheduled to visit that weekend, and normally I would purchase his flight tickets, but this time I didn't. I wondered if he would still come without the financial incentive. To my surprise, Michael did arrive that weekend, having purchased his own ticket. When I opened the door, he immediately hugged me, tears streaming down his face. The raw emotion of the moment affected me too, reminding me that regardless of our complicated history, we were both grieving the same person. His clothes were wrinkled, as if he had packed in a hurry, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He looked exhausted. I invited him in, and we had an honest conversation. He acknowledged that my suspicions were reasonable given our history and his reaction to the letter. He admitted that seeing the paragraph about me had initially angered him because it felt like his mother was pushing him toward me for practical rather than emotional reasons. However, after reflecting on the situation for the past 7 days, he had realized that what I was asking wasn't unreasonable. He told me he was grateful I had even forgiven him after how poorly he had treated me over the years. While the prospect of financial independence was daunting, he understood it was necessary for both of us to move forward with a clean slate. I revealed to Michael that, contrary to what his mother had implied, there was money set aside for him in our will. I offered to help him access some of those funds until he found employment, but to my surprise, he declined. He insisted on doing this independently, saying he needed to prove to himself and to me that his change of heart was genuine. "I've been dependent on others my whole life," he said. "First mom, then you, and my grandparents. Maybe it's time I learned to stand on my own." I respected his decision, and we spent the rest of the weekend making plans for his job search. For the first time, I felt a sense of pride in him that wasn't clouded by obligation or duty. 3 days later, I received an angry call from George and Patricia. They berated me for cutting off Michael financially and forcing him to work through college. I tried explaining that this was a mutual decision and that I had even offered to help him with the money his mother had left him, but they wouldn't listen. They accused me of being selfish and hoarding all the money for myself. "You've just been waiting for a chance to abandon him," George shouted over the phone. "You never wanted him in the first place." Patricia chimed in, "His mother would be ashamed of you. After everything our family has been through, this is how you treat her son?" After they refused to let me explain, I hung up and blocked their numbers. I then called Michael to understand what had happened. He explained that he had casually mentioned to his grandparents that he was looking for a job because he had decided to become financially independent. They had offered to increase his allowance, but he had declined, saying this was something he needed to do himself. George and Patricia had immediately assumed I had forced this change and were demanding I continue supporting Michael as I had for the past 2 years. I told Michael the first didn't feel I owed his grandparents an explanation. This was between him and me. If he was comfortable with our arrangement, their opinion didn't matter to me. Michael apologized for the misunderstanding and offered to speak with his grandparents, but I suggested he focus on his studies and job search instead. Their reaction, while unpleasant, had an unexpected benefit. I no longer felt obligated to maintain contact with them. As for my relationship with Michael, it was finally evolving into something genuine, built on mutual respect rather than obligation or financial dependence. But still I am a bit curious, Ida, for testing my stepson's loyalty after finding a concerning letter? Update 1. It's been 3 weeks since my last post. I've spoken with my brother and a therapist about my situation, which has helped me process my feelings about this whole situation. My brother pointed out something I hadn't considered, that by pushing Michael toward independence, I might actually be giving him the best gift possible: self-reliance. My therapist helped me work through my own grief and guilt, reminding me that setting boundaries isn't the same as abandonment. Michael has been back to visit twice. During his first visit, he brought news that he had secured a part-time job. The pay isn't substantial, but it covers some of his daily expenses. He's also applied for a resident advisor position for next semester, which would provide free housing and a small stipend. We spent that weekend looking over his budget together. Even with his new job, he's still short for tuition. I reminded him about the money his mother had set aside, but again, he declined. Instead, he's applied for additional scholarships and is considering a student loan for the remainder. His determination to handle this on his own continues to surprise me. During his second visit, Michael brought a folder containing all the scholarship applications he had submitted. There were nearly 20 of them, each requiring essays and recommendations. He had organized everything meticulously, with spreadsheets tracking deadlines and requirements. This level of responsibility was something I had never seen from him before. What's been most surprising is Michael's reaction to his grandparents' behavior. He called them directly after learning what they were doing and told them in no uncertain terms to stop interfering. According to Michael, the conversation didn't go well. They accused him of being brainwashed by me and threatened to cut off his allowance if he didn't come to his senses. Michael told them they could keep their money, further strengthening my belief that his change of heart is genuine. He later told me that standing up to his grandparents was something he should have done years ago, especially when they were undermining my relationship with his mother. "They always made me feel like I had to choose between you and my dad's memory," he admitted during our conversation. "I never realized how unfair that was until now."